The roles flipped again. Boeing's comeback has a crack in it. Boeing just had one of its best order months in a decade. In that exact same stretch of weeks, the FAA quietly ordered emergency inspections on 471 of its planes for a structural problem this company already swore it had fixed 7 years ago. If that contrast sounds familiar, it's because 6 weeks ago, this channel called Boeing's comeback against Airbus real. It still is. We'll get into exactly what that recurring problem is and why it keeps coming back no matter how many times Boeing says it's solved. This isn't a story about which company is winning right now. Orders and deliveries go up and down every quarter, and we'll get to those numbers. This is about a pattern that shows up underneath the numbers, one that survives good quarters and bad ones alike. Quick recap, since this builds directly on something we covered before, for most of the last decade, Boeing was the story everyone was watching for the wrong reasons. 2 fatal 737 MAX crashes in Indonesia in 2018 and Ethiopia in 2019, a 20-month worldwide grounding of the entire MAX fleet, and then, just as the company seemed to be putting that behind it, a door plug blew out of an Alaska Airlines flight mid-air in January 2024, forcing another round of intense scrutiny. In between and around all of that, a string of current and former Boeing employees came forward as whistleblowers, alleging a corporate culture that prioritized production schedules and delivery targets over safety checks and quality control. Allegations serious enough to trigger congressional hearings and FAA reviews of Boeing's own internal oversight. Airbus, meanwhile, quietly became the world's best-selling plane maker almost by default. Not because its own production was flawless, it's dealt with plenty of supply chain headaches of its own, particularly with engine suppliers, but because its biggest competitor kept tripping over its own mistakes at exactly the moments airlines were placing their next decade of orders. Then, starting late last year, Boeing began actually turning things around. New leadership took a more careful approach to production increases, agreeing to FAA-supervised step-by-step increases in monthly manufacturing rates, rather than pushing for a fast ramp-up. And, as we covered in the last video, that caution started translating into real commercial results, a genuine order rebound that caught a lot of industry watchers off guard. That was the roles flipped story. Boeing quietly recovering while Airbus dealt with its own production bottlenecks, particularly around engine deliveries from Pratt & Whitney that slowed its ability to hit its own delivery targets. Here's where things stand today, several months later, and it's a genuinely mixed picture, which is exactly why this story deserves a follow-up instead of being left where we last saw it. Boeing had its strongest April for aircraft orders in more than a decade, 136 gross orders compared to just 28 for Airbus that same month, driven heavily by renewed commitments to the 737 MAX line. That's real, and it's not a fluke. Boeing's order intake has been meaningfully stronger through 2026 than it was in either 2023 or 2024.
But zoom out to the full year, and Airbus is still ahead, and the gap actually widened again in July. At the Farnborough Air Show, one of the industry's 2 biggest annual sales events, Airbus booked 204 new gross orders in a single month, driven by major commitments for both its single-aisle and wide-body lines, pushing its year-to-date order total past 1,090 aircraft. That's a lead of 607 aircraft over Boeing for the year so far, a gap that's actually grown since the spring. On deliveries, the pattern is similar. Airbus has handed over 418 aircraft this year through July, compared to Boeing's 367, a 51 aircraft lead. And in terms of pure order value, Airbus's book grew by $12.6 billion more than Boeing's did in just the first half of the year. So both things are true at once. Boeing is recovering. Its monthly order numbers this year would have looked genuinely impressive at almost any point since the first MAX grounding. It is also not winning. Airbus's overall lead for 2026 on both orders and deliveries is wider now than it was when we first covered this story. Depending on which single month you look at, you can walk away with 2 completely different headlines, and both of them would be accurate. Now, here's the part that complicates the recovery narrative even further, and it's genuinely recent. This happened within the last 2 weeks. On August 5, 2026, the FAA published an airworthiness directive ordering structural inspections on 471 U.S.-registered Boeing 737 MAX jets. The concern: potential cracking in the fuselage structure near the forward service door. Airlines have until September 10th to begin the inspections, within specific flight cycle windows tied to how much each individual aircraft has flown. Here's what makes this particular directive interesting, and it's the detail most coverage buried or skipped entirely. This isn't a new type of problem. It's the same category of structural fatigue issue, cracking near fuselage doors, that the FAA first identified back in 2019 on the older 737 Next Generation fleet, involving components known as the pickle fork and bear strap, terms that made headlines briefly at the time and then mostly disappeared from public conversation. Because the MAX shares nearly identical fuselage architecture near the doors with that older NG generation, the FAA has now extended the same precautionary inspection regime to thousands of newer jets, even ones that haven't actually shown any actual cracks yet. This is what regulators call a proactive order, based on shared design lineage and fatigue modeling, not on an incident that's already happened. And it's not the only fresh directive from this same stretch of weeks. 3 weeks earlier, on July 28th, the FAA proposed a separate airworthiness directive covering 453 MAX jets, this time over passenger seats that weren't correctly locked into their floor tracks, a manufacturing quality issue this time, not a design flaw, but still one more inspection order added to the pile in the same month on the same aircraft family from the same regulator. To be fair to Boeing here, because the story deserves that fairness, neither of these issues has been linked to an actual in-flight incident, injury, or accident. These are precautionary, proactive orders, exactly the kind of caution regulators are supposed to apply after the mistakes of the MCAS era, not evidence that those mistakes are repeating. Boeing itself says it supports both inspection orders and has been coordinating with the FAA. This is not 2019 repeating itself in terms of consequences, but it is 2019's underlying design and manufacturing lineage surfacing again 7 years later in a company that is currently trying to tell investors and airlines a story about having fully turned the page. If you found the first Boeing Airbus video useful, this channel does this kind of follow-up regularly, going back to a story once the numbers actually change, instead of just moving on to the next headline. Subscribing helps me keep doing that. No pressure, but I genuinely appreciate it. So, why does this keep happening? Not through malice, and probably not really through simple incompetence either. It's more structural than that, in more than one sense of the word. The 737 MAX and the 737 NG that came before it share a fuselage design that dates back, in its fundamentals, all the way to the original 737 from the 1960s. Boeing has spent 60 years stretching, re-engineering, and modernizing an airframe that was never originally designed for the loads, cycles, and passenger volumes modern narrow-body jets fly today. Every time engineers extend that lineage into a new variant, the Classic, the Next Generation, now the MAX, they're not just adding new engines and avionics, they're also carrying forward decades of structural assumptions that eventually get tested against reality, cycle by cycle, takeoff by takeoff, as fleets age and accumulate flight hours nobody fully modeled 60 years ago. That inherited complexity is also in part why the fix for the newest variant is taking so long. The MAX 10, Boeing's largest 737 variant and the one most directly competing with Airbus's popular A321neo, the exact aircraft driving a huge share of Airbus's order lead, still isn't certified. It finished its certification test flights back on July 28th, but it's still waiting on final FAA sign-off, held up by an unrelated engine anti-ice system problem that's dragged on for well over a year at this point. The smaller MAX 7 finally got certified on August 3rd, capping an 8-year approval process from launch to certification. First deliveries of both variants aren't expected until 2027. Every month that certification slips, Airbus's A321neo keeps signing up airlines that might otherwise have waited to see Boeing's answer land. Here's the broader pattern, and it's worth sitting with because it applies well beyond aviation.
A comeback story and a structural liability aren't opposites. They can run on parallel tracks inside the exact same company at the exact same time because they come from genuinely different parts of the business, moving on genuinely different clocks. Order books respond to sales relationships, pricing terms, financing terms, and airline capacity planning cycles. That's Boeing's commercial team doing real, measurable, effective work right now, and it deserves to be counted as real. Structural inspection directives respond to engineering reality, accumulated over decades of a shared airframe lineage. That's a completely different clock, one that doesn't care how good this quarter's order numbers look, because metal fatigue doesn't read press releases. A company can absolutely be winning back customers and still be working through problems baked into design decisions made long before the current leadership ever took the job. In this case, decisions made in the 1960s by engineers who couldn't have modeled today's flight cycle volumes if they'd tried. The mistake, watching from the outside, is assuming a good sales quarter means the underlying issues are resolved, or conversely, that a new inspection order automatically means the recovery narrative is fake. Usually, uncomfortably, both are just true at once. And the honest version of this story has to hold both at the same time, instead of picking the one that makes a cleaner headline. Where this goes next probably depends less on any single dramatic event than whether Boeing can keep both of these tracks moving in the right direction simultaneously for long enough that the pattern actually breaks instead of just repeating in a new form. The commercial recovery has real momentum behind it. Order intake this year is genuinely stronger than it's been at any point since before the MAX grounding began. But the MAX 10 certification delay pushes Boeing's most direct answer to the A321neo further into 2027, right as Airbus extends its lead using that exact aircraft. And the September 10th inspection deadline is a real near-term test of the other track. If inspectors find actual cracks on a meaningful number of the 471 flagged jets, this becomes a much bigger story very quickly, with real fleets and delivery consequences. If they don't, if this really is precaution rather than a preview, it quietly becomes a footnote, the way most airworthiness directives eventually do, filed away and forgotten by everyone whose job it is to remember. Maybe the more useful way to think about Boeing right now isn't recovering or still broken. It's that both of those are permanently, structurally true for a company built on 60-year-old bones being asked to compete in a market that changes every quarter. The roles between Boeing and Airbus didn't just flip once, they're going to keep flipping in smaller ways for years because one company is racing on a sales calendar and fighting gravity on an engineering one at the same time. If you want to see where this actually goes, the September inspection deadline, the MAX 10 certification, all of it, that's the exact kind of follow-up this channel does. Subscribe if you want to keep seeing it.